For years, the Kremlin had boasted that Russia was wrapped in an armor no enemy could breach. It was a story repeated endlessly, an unbreakable shield, a flawless air defense network, and a leader who claimed control over every threat before it even appeared. But on the night of November 14th, that carefully crafted illusion fractured in the most dramatic way imaginable. It began as retaliation. The previous day, Putin had ordered a heavy-handed strike on Kyiv, a move meant to reassert dominance and mask the growing weaknesses of his military. But instead of cowering, Ukraine answered with something far more devastating than anyone in Moscow anticipated. Within hours, long-range weapons designed and built inside Ukraine were soaring across the night sky toward Novorossiysk, Russia's prized port on the Black Sea. These weren't the old missiles Russia expected. They were refined, extended-range Neptunes, capable of traveling 1,000 kilometers with silent precision. And while Putin believed the S-400 complexes stationed at the port would swat away anything Ukraine launched, what unfolded proved how dangerously overconfident that belief had been. Operators manning the air defenses suddenly searched the sky with mounting confusion. Radar screens lit up with decoys, drones flew low enough to slip under tracking arcs. Cheap kamikaze UAVs were sent ahead not to destroy anything, but to force Russia's most expensive radars to reveal their positions. Once those systems activated, they became targets. And when they became targets, Ukraine delivered its real blow. The first Neptune slammed into the S-400 regiment, responsible for protecting the port. Then came another, and another. The explosions rolled through the night, not as random blasts, but as methodical strikes, each tearing apart a different piece of the air defense network Russia had always portrayed as invincible. 12 S-400 launchers equipment meant to guard Russian soil were turned into burning wreckage in minutes. Suddenly, Novorossiysk, a city Russians believed was beyond the reach of danger, was thrown into chaos. The governor had no choice but to declare a state of emergency. Residents who had spent years hearing that the war was somewhere far away now felt the ground tremble beneath them. Civilians recorded what they saw, not propaganda, raw, uncontrolled flames rising from facilities they were told were safe. For the first time, Russians were confronted with a truth their government had hidden from them. The war could reach them, and the systems meant to protect them were failing. What made this moment so important wasn't only the destruction of military hardware, it was the symbolic collapse of an illusion that had shaped the Kremlin's identity. The S-400 wasn't just a weapon, it was the pride of Russian engineering, the centerpiece of arms export deals, the golden example used to intimidate neighboring countries. And seeing it fall so quickly, so publicly, and so embarrassingly shattered a myth Putin had spent years constructing. Ukraine's operation revealed something deeper than a tactical weakness. It exposed a strategic vulnerability that could no longer be ignored. Russia's defenses were not impenetrable, its leadership was not infallible, and its enemies were not as helpless as Moscow had insisted. The attack also revealed a level of coordination Ukraine had rarely shown so far inside Russian territory. Electronic warfare, decoys, precision missiles all working together in a phase-by-phase strike designed not just to inflict damage, but to humiliate the Russian military and undermine the Kremlin's narrative of absolute control. By the time the fires finally dimmed, one fact had become undeniable. A new chapter in the war had begun. A chapter where Ukraine no longer fought only for survival, but for the ability to reshape the strategic balance entirely. And in doing so, it exposed Russia's greatest fear, that the empire Putin tried to rebuild was far more fragile than he ever wanted the world to see. When the smoke from the destroyed S-400 batteries began to drift over Novorossiysk, a deeper crisis was already unfolding. Russia's air defenses had collapsed, but that was only the first tremor. The real earthquake came moments later, when Ukraine redirected its strike toward the beating heart of Putin's war machine, the oil network that funded every missile, every armored assault, every step of the invasion. The Cheskir's oil terminal, a sprawling complex of tanks and pipelines, had long served as one of Russia's most valuable assets. Its location on the Black Sea allowed the Kremlin to pump billions of dollars worth of crude into global markets. Those revenues had become the backbone of Russia's wartime economy, a lifeline the Kremlin depended on to sustain its operations. But on this night, that lifeline was severed with ruthless accuracy. Neptune missiles and supporting drones didn't aim for random infrastructure. They targeted the core pumping units, loading docks, and processing facilities essential for moving oil out of the port. Each impact wasn't just an explosion, it was a calculated strike on Russia's financial arteries. Within hours, the terminal was engulfed in chaos. Operations were halted, and Russia's leaders were forced to confront a truth they had never planned to admit. Their economic fortress was not only vulnerable, it was collapsing from the inside. The consequences rippled instantly across the world. Brent crude prices jumped within minutes of the attack. Traders, analysts, and governments scrambled to interpret what had happened. 20% of Russia's seaborne oil exports gone overnight. A disruption like this was not merely an economic inconvenience, it was a shock that exposed how deeply the global market was tied to the stability Moscow claimed to control. But the damage didn't stop there. Next to the Russian facility sat a critical installation belonging to Kazakhstan, part of the Caspian Pipeline Consortium, and because of the strike, it too was forced to shut down. This was an unintended but devastating side effect, a reminder that Russia's allies now paid the price for Moscow's inability to protect its own territory. Kazakhstan, long walking a delicate line between cooperation and distance with the Kremlin, suddenly found itself economically injured by the very partner it relied on. It wasn't Ukraine that caused the disruption, it was Russia's failure to secure infrastructure both nations depended on. The message was unmistakable. Associating with Moscow came with risks that could no longer be ignored, and while oil burned in Novorossiysk, another front opened thousands of kilometers away. Japan, watching the chaos unfold, tightened its sanctions against Russia's shadow fleet, the illicit network the Kremlin used to secretly transport crude in defiance of international rules. New restrictions meant that ships moving Russian oil through loopholes were now far more exposed, far easier to target, and far harder to ensure. The timing could not have been worse for Moscow. Ukraine had struck Russia's physical supply chain, Japan struck its covert supply chain, and global markets struck its financial supply chain. It was a perfect storm, one the Kremlin never imagined would hit them all at once. The myth of Russia's energy invincibility had always been one of Putin's favorite narratives. Oil revenue was his currency of power, his bargaining chip with foreign governments, and his tool for suppressing dissent at home. But that night, the illusion shattered in flames, bright enough to be seen from across the harbor. The Kremlin tried to downplay the operation. Statements were rushed, narratives rewritten, numbers manipulated, yet none of it mattered. What mattered was the silence, the kind that comes when a nation realizes it has lost control of the very systems it believed made it untouchable. Novorossiysk wasn't just an attack on infrastructure. It was an attack on the idea that Putin's empire could withstand pressure indefinitely. It was proof that his economic fortress, once thought to be the strongest part of his regime, was now cracking, leaking, and burning. And as the fires raged through the night, the world understood something new. Ukraine had not only struck a port, it had struck the foundation of Putin's power and exposed just how fragile that foundation truly was. The most devastating consequence of the Novorossiysk strike was not measured in destroyed launchers or lost oil revenue. It was measured in something far more intimate. The moment ordinary Russians realized the war they had been told was distant had crossed into their own neighborhoods. The fire and smoke rising from the port were only the beginning. What shook people to their core was the sudden revelation of what lay hidden among them, secrets their government never meant for them to see. For years, the Kremlin claimed to be shielding its citizens from danger, but the explosion of a massive ammunition depot inside a residential district exposed a far darker reality. This depot, tucked between homes, schools, and apartment buildings, had been placed there deliberately. It existed not to protect the people, but to use them as cover. The blast that erupted from it illuminated more than the sky. It illuminated a truth the government could no longer conceal. Families who had spent their lives believing they were safe discovered that they had been living beside a powder keg. Their fear was not directed at Ukraine's missiles, but at the cynical strategy that put them in harm's way. Putin's narrative of stability, his central promise to the Russian people, unraveled in an instant. This betrayal was not new, but it had never been so visible. The Kremlin had always relied on secrecy, misinformation, and selective truth. But explosions do not lie. Flames do not respect propaganda. And when the ammunition facility erupted, Russians were left to confront the consequences of choices made far above them. Choices made by leaders who had asked for loyalty while offering little in return. The shock spread quickly. The governor's hasty declaration of a state of emergency became a symbol of panic, not leadership. Social media filled with videos recorded by civilians, not state-approved cameras. Every clip contradicted the official claim that everything was under control. In those moments, control was the one thing the Kremlin no longer had. The psychological fallout rippled far beyond Novorossiysk. The Russian people, the very population Putin insisted he was protecting now, understood that their lives were part of the war's battlefield. The walls of distance that once insulated them from the conflict collapsed. And with that collapse, their trust in the government fractured. This wasn't simply a military failure, it was a moral one. It exposed a system built on convenience rather than protection, on deceptions rather than duty. The same government that insisted Ukraine was targeting civilians had been storing explosives next to children's playgrounds. The hypocrisy was impossible to ignore. As the reality of the situation settled in, something shifted inside Russia. The myth of the untouchable fortress cracked first quietly, then unmistakably. The people who had once believed the Kremlin's assurances now faced the undeniable truth of their vulnerability. They weren't shielded by their government, they were being gambled with. What made this moment so historically significant was the silence that followed. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of realization. A silence born from millions of private thoughts, each leading to the same question. If the government truly cared about its citizens, why were they placed in danger for the sake of a war that brought them no benefit? Ukraine had struck a target, but the deeper wound came from within Russia itself. The attack didn't just reveal military weaknesses, it exposed the internal decay of a system that claimed to be strong, compassionate, and protective. It forced Russians to acknowledge that the war was not only costing lives at the front, it was now endangering the people at home. By the time the fires dimmed and the emergency crews retreated, one fact had become impossible to ignore. The Kremlin had not failed because Ukraine was strong. It failed because it had built its power on a foundation of denial and manipulation. And when the missiles hit Novorossiysk, that foundation finally crumbled, leaving millions of Russians wondering what else their leaders had hidden from them and how much more they would be asked to endure. The shockwaves from Novorossiysk reached far beyond the port. They traveled straight into the halls of the Kremlin, where fear was no longer something officials could disguise. The destruction of the S-400 batteries and the paralysis of the oil terminal exposed not only vulnerabilities in Russia's defenses, but a far more dangerous truth. The country had run out of men to defend itself. For months, the pressure on Russia's armed forces had been building. Losses on the front lines climbed relentlessly. Units were stretched thin, relying on inexperienced recruits and exhausted veterans who had already served longer than promised. Every strategic setback forced Moscow into a desperate calculation. Where should the remaining forces be placed, and what could be left undefended? The attack on Novorossiysk shattered that fragile balance. Suddenly, Russia needed troops to protect refineries, air bases, oil terminals, and transport routes deep inside its own territory. But reinforcing those sites required manpower the Kremlin no longer had. and replacing fallen soldiers at the front required numbers that weren't available. Every decision created a shortage somewhere else. Faced with this dilemma, the Kremlin fell back on a tool it both feared and depended on: mobilization. The word alone carried a weight Putin could no longer ignore. The partial mobilization of 2022 had been a national humiliation. Hundreds of thousands of educated young men had fled the country within days, creating a brain drain the state was still struggling to recover from. Industries stagnated, universities lost talent, hospitals struggled with shortages. The country had survived the political cost only because the Kremlin crushed criticism before it could spread. This time, Putin knew he couldn't afford another mass exodus. So instead of openly announcing a new mobilization, he turned to digital coercion, a silent, invisible web of restrictions designed to trap the population inside the country. Exit bans appeared automatically in government databases. Travel permissions vanished without warning. Anyone flagged for military eligibility discovered their passports had become useless overnight. This was not a draft, it was a digital cage. Young engineers, skilled workers, and university graduates were suddenly barred from leaving, their names quietly added to lists controlled by the FSB. Many did not respond to military summonses. Instead, they slipped underground, moved between friends' apartments, or took remote jobs that allowed them to avoid authorities. A new class of internal exiles formed, citizens still inside Russia, but living as though hunted by their own government. The Kremlin underestimated the cost of this desperation. Without technicians, factories slowed. Without skilled workers, infrastructure repairs stalled. Without engineers, oil and gas operations struggled to remain functional. The war had created a manpower crisis, but mobilization had created a workforce crisis. The two forces collided like tectonic plates beneath Russia's already fragile economy. And as these internal cracks widened, one of Putin's most misguided decisions emerged, assigning reserve soldiers and aging veterans to defend strategic energy sites. It was a solution rooted not in strategy, but in delusion. Ukraine was now striking targets more than 1,000 kilometers away with advanced, maneuverable cruise missiles. The idea that men in their 50s and 60s could stop such weapons revealed the Kremlin's growing detachment from reality. The mobilization crisis was more than a military problem, it was a societal warning. A government that once prided itself on order now depended on fear to keep its citizens from fleeing. A nation that claimed strength was now held together by digital restrictions and bureaucratic threats. The social contract stability in exchange for obedience was beginning to collapse under the weight of its contradictions. Russia was discovering what many empires learned too late: when weakness is concealed for too long, its eventual exposure is catastrophic. And as the Kremlin scrambled to contain the fallout, the country realized something profound. The crisis was not caused by a single attack. It was the result of years spent denying reality. The war was no longer just straining Russia. It was devouring the very system that launched it. As the Kremlin scrambled to contain the chaos unleashed by the attack on Novorossiysk, an even deeper disaster was unfolding quietly across the country. It wasn't the fire at the port that threatened to paralyze Russia. It was the sudden realization that the nation was running out of the very thing that kept its economy and its military alive: fuel. Ukraine's long campaign of striking refineries had already pushed Russia close to the edge. Production capacity had plummeted, storage depots were strained, and regional shortages began appearing like warning lights on a failing machine. For a time, Moscow survived on reserves, hoping that prices could be stabilized long enough for public frustration to cool. But the destruction of one of the country's most important terminals shattered that illusion. The fuel crisis didn't begin with silence, it began with lines. Drivers queuing for hours, farmers searching for diesel, transport companies rationing routes. Each shortage added to a growing sense that something foundational was breaking. Russia, an empire built on energy exports, could no longer guarantee gasoline for its own people. Desperation pushed the Kremlin toward a lifeline, Belarus. By late September, the numbers coming from Minsk looked dramatic on paper: tens of thousands of tons of gasoline and diesel shipped to Russia. But these figures were misleading. Russia consumed more than 3 million tons of gasoline in a typical month. The Belarusian shipments covered barely a sliver of what was required. It was like attempting to refill a dry ocean with a single garden hose. Still, Putin needed the symbolism. Belarusian fuel tankers rolling across the border created the impression of control, of partnership, of relief. But the illusion evaporated quickly. As fuel arrived in one region, shortages grew in another. As urban centers stabilized, rural areas collapsed. The government could not be everywhere at once, and the crisis spread faster than it could be managed. Eventually, Moscow took a step it had avoided for decades: a complete ban on gasoline exports. It was not a strategic decision, it was a scream for air. Cutting off exports meant cutting off revenue. Cutting off revenue meant shrinking the war budget. Cutting the war budget meant weakening the very military Putin insisted was winning. But with domestic anger rising and public patience evaporating, the Kremlin had no choice. The ban was an act of political survival, not economic calculation. Yet even this drastic measure couldn't stop the internal collapse. Regions began imposing their own restrictions. Prices skyrocketed despite state controls. Black markets multiplied, feeding on desperation. Truckers slept in their vehicles waiting for fuel that never came. Farmers watched harvests spoil. The fragility of Russia's logistics network, long ignored, now revealed itself in full. Then came the disaster near Smolensk, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. A train carrying millions of liters of desperately needed gasoline derailed and erupted into a giant inferno after colliding with a truck at a simple level crossing. The flames consumed tanker after tanker, turning a critical supply mission into a burning monument of failure. The accident shut down a major rail artery between Belarus and Russia, halting not only fuel shipments but military transport and civilian goods. It was exactly the kind of catastrophe a stable nation prevents, and exactly the kind an overstretched, under-resourced system cannot. The Kremlin attempted to dismiss the event as a routine mishap, but no explanation could hide the truth that was now painfully clear. A nation claiming to be an energy superpower was unable to move gasoline safely across its own territory during wartime. This crisis, exposed by shortages, black markets, and burning tankers, revealed a deeper decay. The war had not simply strained the system, it had pushed every part of it beyond its limits. Supply chains failed, institutions stumbled, leadership faltered, and through it all, ordinary Russians were left to carry the burden. By the time fuel finally began to trickle back into certain regions, the lesson had already taken root. The Kremlin could project strength on television. It could boast about missile systems and battlefield advances, but it could not hide the far more humiliating truth. Russia, the nation built on oil, was now struggling to power its own society, and for millions of citizens stuck in endless lines and watching shelves run empty, the myth of stability had finally collapsed. The fuel shortages that swept across Russia were not just a logistical failure. They became the breaking point of a fragile agreement that had defined Putin's rule for more than 2 decades. For years, the Kremlin demanded silence in exchange for stability. Citizens were told that if they stayed out of politics, their lives would remain predictable. It was a trade many accepted until the war shattered it piece by piece. The first cracks appeared in the countryside. Russia's agricultural regions, the fields that fed the nation, were hit hardest by the fuel collapse. Harvest season arrived, but diesel did not. Farmers who had worked the same land for generations watched machinery sit idle. Crops that should have been collected were left exposed, and entire harvests slipped away while officials insisted everything was under control. The loss wasn't just economic, it was emotional. A blow to communities built on self-reliance and pride. Then the crisis spread to the cities, Overnight, stability turned into desperation. Drivers circled gas stations until their fuel gauges dropped to zero. Others waited in endless lines, unsure whether the pumps would run dry before they reached the front. The tension grew with every hour. Arguments erupted, fists replaced patience. Even families who had never questioned the government now felt betrayed by shortages that could no longer be excused or hidden. The Kremlin tried to soften the blow with reassurances, but nothing could mask the emptiness of the shelves or the inflation that followed the breakdown in transportation. Food prices surged, deliveries slowed. Small businesses that relied on transport found themselves unable to function. The reality of national fragility revealed itself in the most basic places: grocery stores, bus stops, markets, and kitchens. The government faced a dilemma with no acceptable answer. Fuel could be sent to the front lines, where armored vehicles and artillery units required diesel to survive, or fuel could be diverted to civilians to prevent unrest. If it went to the military, the home front would fall into chaos. If it went to the people, the army would become immobile targets. Either option carried a cost the Kremlin could not afford. Ukraine understood this perfectly. Its strategy was never just about destroying infrastructure, it was about forcing Russia into an impossible decision. By striking refineries and oil facilities deep inside the country, Ukraine exposed a truth that Moscow had buried. A modern war cannot be won if the home front collapses. The pressure mounted. The Kremlin's promises of control sounded hollow. The myth of Russian resilience, repeated endlessly in state media, cracked under the weight of reality. What the government had spent years building an image of order, strength, and unshakable authority was now eroding in full view of the population. And slowly, something deeper began to shift inside Russian society. The fuel lines, the empty shelves, the farmers staring at ruined harvests, they created a kind of awakening. People realized that their sacrifices were not sustaining a noble cause, but feeding a war that offered them nothing in return. They saw a government willing to risk their livelihoods, their savings, their future, and even their lives to preserve its own power. The social contract was dissolving. This wasn't a dramatic revolution or a sudden uprising. It was a quieter collapse, the kind that grows day by day, as people stop believing in the promises of those who claim to protect them. A kind of silent reckoning began spreading across the country, fueled not by ideology, but by exhaustion. A system can survive fear, it can survive anger, but it cannot survive when millions of citizens lose faith in its ability to provide the basic foundations of daily life. The crisis that began with a missile strike had now evolved into something far more dangerous for the Kremlin, a crisis of legitimacy, and no number of speeches, threats, or slogans could restore the stability that once kept the country in line. For the first time in decades, Russia was not questioning its enemies, it was questioning itself. When the war finally reached Russia's heart, it didn't arrive with tanks or missiles. It arrived with the collapse of ordinary life. And in that collapse, the Kremlin's greatest fear became reality. The people realized that the fortress they trusted had been crumbling long before the first explosion ever reached their shores.